Agents questioning two men from Somalia who say they were stopped and had to prove that they were living here legally.
At 4:20 a.m., the silence across several American neighborhoods broke at the exact moment as federal tactical teams moved in and pulled suspects from apartments, garages, and offices that had looked ordinary just hours earlier. ICE, the FBI, HSI, and armed federal units swept through multiple locations, seizing drugs, cash, weapons, and stacks of documents that hinted at something far larger than a routine arrest. This was not a random crackdown or a local crime sweep, but a coordinated strike aimed at a criminal system that had operated quietly for years behind the cover of everyday life. What follows traces the investigation step by step, revealing how money, paperwork, and people moved through this network without drawing attention. Subscribe to Military Power, because this story is only beginning to surface. Federal attention turned toward Minnesota daycare centers after a quiet pattern began to emerge within state assistance systems, and while the data itself appeared clean on the surface, the rhythm behind the payments raised concerns among analysts monitoring the flow of public funds. Subsidy transfers arrived on schedule, week after week, with amounts that never fluctuated, even during holidays, weather closures, or staffing shortages that usually interrupt childcare operations. These centers continued to receive support as if dozens of children were present every day, yet there were no matching signs of daily activity to support that picture. The situation did not trigger an immediate criminal response, because on paper, everything followed procedure. However, the scale of the money involved forced federal agencies to step closer and look directly at the ground level, where those numbers were supposed to come from. Early in the morning, inspection teams moved out quietly, spreading across different neighborhoods with no flashing lights and no visible show of force, because the mission at that stage remained administrative rather than tactical. Agents approached buildings that blended effortlessly into residential blocks and commercial strips, places that carried signs with friendly names and cartoon animals painted on the windows. Doors opened slowly under the inspection authority, and what greeted the teams was not chaos or resistance, but stillness. Hallways stood empty. Classrooms sat silent. The absence of sound became the first warning sign, because functioning daycares are rarely quiet for long. Inside these locations, agents walked room to room, taking in details that contradicted the records they carried on their tablets. Chairs were neatly stacked as if they had never been used. The playmats showed no wear, and the shelves held toys arranged carefully but untouched. Refrigerators contained little more than expired snacks and bottled water, not the steady supply required for daily meals. There were no backpacks lined along the walls, no artwork taped to bulletin boards, and no sign that children had been present at any point that week. The contrast between the calm interior and the volume of government funding tied to these addresses created a pressure that followed every step the teams took. Despite these findings, the inspections remained limited in scope, because they were still classified as welfare compliance reviews rather than criminal raids. Agents documented conditions, photographed rooms, and logged observations with precise timestamps. The process was slow and deliberate, driven by procedure instead of urgency, yet the tension grew with each completed checklist. These facilities were approved to care for dozens of children, and each approval unlocked thousands of dollars in public support. However, the physical evidence on site failed to meet even the minimum operational requirements. At one registered daycare, the inspection reached a deeper level, shifting concern into alarm. The front door opened to an empty lobby where a single security guard sat behind a desk, watching a small television with the volume low. No parents were waiting, no children were being dropped off, and no staff were preparing for the day. As inspectors moved further inside, the silence remained complete. Rooms designed for infant care contained unused cribs, still wrapped in protective covers. Activity schedules hung on the walls but showed no marks, notes, or changes from week to week. The building appeared frozen in time. Documents stored on site painted a very different picture. Enrollment rosters listed more than 700 children, complete with names, ages, and attendance records that showed consistent participation. Signature blocks repeated in identical patterns, and several pages displayed handwriting that matched too closely to belong to different parents. Attendance sheets reported full classrooms every day, even on dates when weather records confirmed severe winter conditions that would normally close schools across the region. These records had passed through multiple levels of approval without challenge, creating the appearance of a thriving care center that existed only on paper. As inspectors cross-checked physical observations against digital files, the gap between reality and documentation became impossible to ignore. A daycare approved for such a large population should have shown signs of constant movement and wear, yet the floors were clean, the corners untouched, and the equipment unused. Licensing certificates hung on walls beside emergency evacuation plans that had never been put into practice. The paperwork followed every rule. Every form was completed correctly, and every box was checked. However, the building itself told a different story through its emptiness. What stood out most was not a single error, but repetition. Similar findings were observed at other registered locations under the same management. Each site displayed the same pattern of silence, the same lack of activity, and the same careful arrangement, suggesting preparation for inspection rather than daily operation. Payment records showed steady transfers moving into accounts connected to these facilities, reinforcing the idea that this was not a one-time mistake, but a system repeating itself across multiple addresses. Even at this stage, no arrests were made, because the purpose of the visit remained limited to verification rather than enforcement. Still, the mood shifted among the teams as documentation grew heavier with each discovery. This was no longer about correcting administrative errors or improving oversight. The amount of public money involved and the consistency of the discrepancies pointed towards something deliberate. Inspectors exchanged brief looks as they sealed evidence folders and prepared reports for higher review, aware that the situation had crossed an invisible line. Before leaving the final site, agents stood briefly outside, watching the street come to life as morning traffic increased. Parents drove past unaware, children headed to real schools elsewhere in the city, and the buildings behind the inspectors remained quiet, empty, and unfunded. The sense of an approaching storm settled in because once these findings reached federal leadership, the response would no longer remain confined to welfare oversight. The moment the investigation changed came without warning. Inside a quiet office that had already shown signs of careful staging rather than real work, inspectors moved with measured steps as a steel safe was opened under supervision. The heavy door swung wide to reveal stacks of cash wrapped tightly in plastic and bound with tape. The money filled the space in clean blocks, pressed flat and organized in a way that spoke of planning and movement rather than neglect or chance. This was not loose currency or personal savings, but packaged funds prepared to be moved, counted, and hidden again. The room fell silent as the meaning sank in. Beside the cash sat folders and sealed envelopes that carried markings unfamiliar to welfare inspectors, but instantly recognizable to those trained to track organized crime. Symbols, codes, and contact lists appeared in documents that had no place inside a child care facility. Shipping notes referenced routes and handoffs that pointed far beyond state lines, while handwritten pages listed names and numbers that repeated across different sets of files. Each piece added weight to the discovery, because together they formed a picture that no longer fit within the frame of administrative fraud. At that point, the inspection lost its neutral tone. The presence of organized crime indicators forced a pause as inspectors secured the room and contacted federal leadership. What began as a welfare review crossed a clear threshold, because public funds are now connected directly to criminal structures known for violence, intimidation, and control. The case shifted from oversight to enforcement, and responsibility moved upward to federal agencies equipped to handle networks rather than paperwork. This was no longer about correcting errors or tightening compliance, but about stopping a system built to exploit trust on a massive scale. The reason for this shift was severe and straightforward. Welfare fraud damages budgets, but organized crime threatens communities because money becomes a tool to move drugs, weapons, and people. The discovery inside that safe showed that the daycare operation was not an isolated scam, but a financial engine feeding something much larger. Once that link appeared, federal law required a different response, and the file was reclassified accordingly. The quiet inspection had transformed into the opening stage of a criminal investigation. As evidence teams cataloged the cash and documents, analysts began connecting names and addresses across databases. Patterns emerged quickly. The same individual appeared repeatedly, not only as a daycare director, but as a signer on multiple accounts and a listed manager for several registered facilities. Each center had been approved, inspected on paper, and cleared for funding, yet field teams had already confirmed that these places lacked any real service activity. The structure resembled a web, with one person at the center and several empty nodes spreading outward. Records showed that this director controlled multiple daycare locations across the region, each one claiming enrollment numbers high enough to trigger large subsidy payments. On official forms, staff rosters appeared complete, safety certifications were up to date, and attendance records remained steady from month to month. In the field, however, inspectors found locked doors, silent rooms, and no trace of daily care. The contrast revealed intent. Running one empty facility could suggest error or neglect, but operating several under the same pattern points to a design issue. Financial trails reinforced that conclusion. Payments flowed into accounts linked to each registered center, then moved onward through secondary accounts tied to the same director. The consistency of these transfers showed coordination rather than coincidence. Money entered through legitimate programs, then exited through channels that no longer resembled childcare operations. This repetition across locations demonstrated organization, not confusion, and the scale involved erased any remaining doubt about purpose. The director did not appear in public records as a criminal figure, but the administrative footprint told a different story. Addresses overlapped, contact numbers repeated. Emergency contacts listed the same names across unrelated facilities. Every document looked acceptable on its own, yet together they revealed a pattern of duplication that allowed funds to move without proper oversight. This was not a single failure, but a method built to repeat itself. As federal teams reviewed the growing body of evidence, the language inside the operation shifted. Discussions moved away from audits and compliance toward structure and hierarchy. The daycare system had served as a cover, providing steady access to public money without drawing attention. That money then became flexible capital, able to support criminal activities that operated far from the buildings that generated the funds. The case now carried the weight of organized crime, not welfare abuse. Field teams returned to several locations to verify earlier findings, while financial analysts continued to map connections. Each visit confirmed the same reality. Approved facilities existed only in records. Physical spaces remained empty. Staff lists showed no corresponding individuals in employment databases. The repetition of these facts across multiple sites underscored how carefully the system had been built. Nothing about it relied on speed or force. It depended on patience and routine. The discovery of cartel-linked materials removed any remaining doubt about the network's nature. Cartels operate through layers of separation, using legitimate fronts to shield their core operations. The daycare structure aligned with that model, offering legitimacy, a regular income, and minimal scrutiny. Once investigators recognized that alignment, the case could no longer be treated as local or limited. Federal jurisdiction expanded, and coordination increased. By the end of the day, the investigation had taken on a new identity. Evidence rooms filled with sealed boxes, digital copies of documents, and photographed cash stacks. Teams briefed one another with urgency, but without making a noise, aware that exposure at this stage could prompt suspects to flee or destroy records. The quiet tension that had defined the inspection phase now carried a sharper edge. The system had been exposed, but it had not yet been dismantled. Outside the facilities, nothing appeared to have changed. Streets remained calm, and buildings still blended into their surroundings. That contrast sharpened the threat, because networks like this survive by appearing ordinary until pressure forces them to react. With the discovery of organized crime ties, the investigation was prepared to move from documentation to pursuit, setting the stage for actions that would no longer remain confined to offices and files. Money did not sit still once it entered the welfare system, and federal teams traced its movement through layers designed to blur its origin. Funds were left in public programs through clean digital transfers, passed through accounts that existed only on paper, and then flowed outward into international corridors used to move capital beyond easy reach. Each step followed a regular rhythm, with payments moving on schedule as if driven by a clock rather than by real activity. There were no payroll spikes, no supply purchases, and no signs of daily operation tied to these transfers. Minnesota did not consume the money. It passed it along. Analysts mapped the flow with careful attention, watching lines appear across screens that connected welfare deposits to intermediary accounts. These accounts held funds briefly before re-releasing them, often within hours, as if designed to prevent accumulation and reduce visibility. The exact amounts were repeated, the same timing was returned, and the same routes remained active regardless of local conditions. This pattern did not reflect the needs of a child care service. It reflected control. International transfer paths soon emerged, linking domestic accounts to overseas remittance channels that federal agencies had long monitored. These corridors served as a haven for criminal organizations that relied on distance and jurisdictional gaps to protect their operations. Funds moved outward without delay, crossing borders in a way that stripped them of their original identity. Once outside the country, the money no longer resembled public assistance. It became an anonymous capital, ready to support whatever purpose it was put to. The absence of real activity at the source sharpened the conclusion. Facilities receiving large sums showed no hiring, no equipment purchases, and no service delivery. Yet the financial cycle continued without interruption. This separation between movement and function confirmed that Minnesota served as a waypoint rather than a destination. The state provided access, legitimacy, and flow, while the true objectives existed elsewhere. As the financial picture solidified, pressure closed in on the individual at the center of the network. With documents exposed and accounts flagged, the option to remain disappeared. Surveillance units tracked sudden changes in behavior, including canceled appointments and hurried movements that suggested preparation rather than routine. The paper system that once protected the operation had collapsed, leaving only physical escape as an option. Coastal monitoring picked up activity linked to the suspect as plans shifted toward departure by sea. A private vessel prepared quietly, its departure scheduled to avoid attention, and its route set toward open water. Federal units adjusted quickly, extending surveillance from land to shoreline. The focus narrowed from spreadsheets to movement, and the pursuit entered a new phase. As the vessel moved away from the dock, tracking continued without interruption. Surveillance maintained distance, allowing the boat to believe it had slipped free. Water reflected the early light as engines pushed forward, carrying a person who understood that paperwork no longer offered protection. The choice to flee confirmed the conclusions drawn from financial analysis. When systems fail, flight follows. Approach teams worked in silence, closing the gap with precision. Speed was controlled, angles calculated, and timing synchronized to prevent sudden turns or escapes. The water offered no cover once interception began. Federal vessels moved into position, cutting off the routes and forcing the boat to slow down. The commands were followed, and the transfer from escape to custody occurred on open water, without chaos, but with finality. The arrest ended the attempt to vanish, but it opened a deeper path. Devices and materials recovered during the capture led investigators to locations far removed from the daycare buildings. These leads describe places built for production and control, rather than for public display. The network revealed its next layer. Teams assembled for a coordinated operation against a site hidden behind industrial walls. This was not a single entry, but a planned strike involving multiple units with distinct roles. Some teams focused on securing entry points, while others prepared to move inside, and support units held positions to block escape routes. Every movement carried weight, because intelligence indicated the presence of both production equipment and confined individuals. When the operation began, the scale of the problem became clear. Inside the facility, machinery ran continuously, and production spaces stretched across multiple floors. Materials moved in cycles that reflected industrial output rather than small-scale activity. The operation did not rely on improvisation, it relied on structure. As teams advanced, they located rooms where people were held under control, separated from exits, and monitored. These individuals showed signs of exhaustion and fear, evidence of prolonged confinement. Extraction moved carefully, with agents guiding them through secured corridors while maintaining focus on clearing the rest of the site. The priority remained clear: secure lives first. Numbers continued to rise as more areas were cleared. Dozens of people emerged from the shadows, each confirming that the facility served as more than a workplace. It functioned as a holding site within a broader system. The presence of both production and captivity revealed the true nature of the network. With the facility secured, evidence teams documented the environment, equipment, records, and transport materials filled rooms designed for scale. Nothing appeared temporary. This was infrastructure built to last and to operate without interruption. The concept of isolated fraud is no longer applicable. The connection back to daycare operations now made sense. Those buildings provided cover and cash, while sites like this carried out the real work. What appeared harmless on the surface fed something dangerous beneath. The network did not grow by chance. It grew through patience, repetition, and invisibility. As dawn approached, federal units stood inside the cleared compound, aware that they had only exposed one layer of a wider system. The path forward would not slow. The next phase would extend outward, following routes that crossed state lines and entered deeper territory, where the full scope of the operation awaited confrontation. What began as a quiet inspection of licensed daycare centers ended in the exposure of a criminal structure that had learned how to thrive within ordinary systems. Inspectors arrived looking for missing paperwork and irregular attendance records, yet each step forward pulled the case further away from administrative error and closer to organized crime. Empty classrooms led to false rosters, which in turn led to hidden money, and this secret money opened paths that stretched beyond state borders. The shift from welfare oversight to federal enforcement did not happen by accident. It happened because every layer revealed intent, repetition, and control. This case shows how modern criminal networks no longer rely on dark alleys or violent takeovers to grow. Instead, they move quietly through programs built on trust, using routine approvals and predictable processes as cover. Daycare licenses, subsidy schedules, and compliance forms became tools rather than safeguards. On the surface, everything seemed to follow the rules. Underneath, those rules created steady access to money that could be redirected without drawing attention. The danger was not chaos, but normality. From this perspective, the most troubling question is not how one network was built, but how many others may still be operating in a similar manner. If oversight remains slow or fragmented, similar structures can continue to exist, hidden behind paperwork that appears complete and legitimate. Criminal organizations adapt quickly, and when one pathway is exposed, others are tested. Systems designed for efficiency and trust become attractive targets when verification lags behind funding. Without stronger checks, silence becomes a form of protection. This reality places pressure on federal authorities to act earlier and with greater force. Waiting for apparent signs of crime allows networks time to entrench themselves and expand their influence. Early intervention, cross-agency coordination, and physical verification are no longer optional steps. They're the only way to prevent public programs from becoming supply lines for organized crime. When money moves faster than oversight, enforcement must move faster than money. The more profound lesson is clear. Modern crime does not always hide in the shadows or announce itself with violence. It often hides in plain sight, wrapped in forms, approvals, and trusted roles. It survives because people expect legality to equal safety. This case illustrates the dangers of assuming that compliance is sufficient when systems reward it without requiring proof. Trust without verification creates space, and criminal networks know how to fill that space patiently. As investigations widen and new connections emerge, this story stands as a warning rather than a conclusion. What was uncovered here was not a single failure, but a method that can be repeated wherever large flows of public money move with limited scrutiny. The response cannot end with one arrest or one raid. It must reshape how institutions protect themselves from exploitation. If you want to continue following how federal agencies dismantle hidden networks like this, and what these cases mean for the future of enforcement, subscribe to Military Power. And now, consider this question and share your view in the comments. Do you fear the crimes you see on the streets, or the systems you trust every day that may be quietly working against you?